This is the Tree of Life, Season 13, Chapter 8. Before I begin this episode, I noticed that a few errors have been cropping up in previous podcasts. So I will correct an error in the last episode, where displacement mirroring was referred to as both a 180-degree phase shift and a 90-degree phase shift. This is not correct. Nonlinear displacement events are 180-degree phase shifts. Displacement mirroring, pursuant to the redistribution of impulse, are 90-degree phase shifts. In this episode, we will be bringing together Season 12, Chapter 4, with the discussion in this season. To start out, the scale of negation was how we phrased the discussion around how the length of the substitution time corresponding to the negated impulse determines whether, in the context of infinite recursion, the convoluted paths associated with the 9 descending levels implicate another person in generating infinite recursion. The idea was that when you are talking about a short substitution time action, corresponding to negation, the scale by which each convoluted path below approaches infinite recursion is limited by whether there is an embedded intersection with some other person. In other words, negated impulses or movements, which are associated with a longer substitution period, are more likely to produce within those first 9 descending paths a subsequent embedded spatial intersection, which produces 9 more descending paths, and so on and so forth. We also talked about how this scale of negation associates those negated movements with some drag coefficient, as if the movements themselves are experiencing drag within some fluid, which is the self-conscious bodily rhythms. Now, in this episode, I would like to talk about how the concealed impulses associated with those rhythms, that is, in negation, in their manifestation by need, as opposed to self-consciously, manifests these impulses with a kind of drag within the self-conscious bodily cycles or rhythms. To start out, the self-conscious bodily cycles are associated with distinct orders corresponding to levels associated with each order of rhythm. This is to say that the cycles each represent some period associated with the flipping of phase from one chiral structure to another. These structures are hybrid structures, thus represent some component, which is negational, and some component, which is affirmational, associated with dialectical impulses. The affirmational component of these structures generates resonant cavities, which we have seen most people exist within, associated with a kind of resonance. That is to say, that the input and output associated with path parsimony and the conjoined space cancels out. We also talked in Season 12, Chapter 4, and other episodes, how there are 2 components of these cycles, the other component being that associated with the negational component of each structure corresponding to each phase. In that episode, we described the scale of negation as a factor in infinite recursion, but we also conceptualized actions pursuant to negation as movements through a fluid associated with those cycles, generating a kind of drag. This drag thus reflects a kind of drag coefficient associated with a particular order of rhythm or cycle. Now, because we can see that sublimation at the end of a substitution event, or at the conclusion of a dissonant space, produces elongation of the phase associated with a particular cycle, we can see that this drag or damping represents a particular impact on the resonance within a cycle. That is to say, that just as the orders of cycle of the bodily rhythms represent resonant cavities, so too can we say that they exhibit a characteristic of damping. In the case of sublimation at the conclusion of a substitution event, we can describe that manner of damping as overdamping, because it returns to the equilibrium associated with its steady-state output by means of exponential decay. Now, in physics and engineering, the quality factor is a parameter that describes how underdamped an oscillator or resonator is. In the case of the damping described within the above discussion, what we are talking about is a low quality factor leading to overdamping. But in the case of infinite recursion, what we are talking about is a high quality factor, or infinite quality factor. Thus, you can conceptualize the extent of recursion within any descending paths associated with an intersection as a reflection of the quality factor associated with that person's action in that moment. Now, the scale of negation, as the starting point for the length of time associated with the first 9 levels of convoluted paths associated with a potential infinite recursion event, can be understood through the quality factor associated with a particular resonant cavity, or set of bodily cycles associated with a particular person. In mechanical systems, the Q factor represents the effect of drag. Thus, we can see that these two concepts are connected, in the sense that the scale of negation associated with a substitution time is connected to the Q factor associated with a series of particular potentially infinite recursive paths. If we can understand that an individual possesses, through their bodily rhythms, a particular Q factor, then it becomes possible to see that when that Q factor becomes infinite, the result is an infinite recursive event. That's the end of the podcast for today.